Hi. Before going to video, please subscribe to my channel for more interesting stuff.
Story from r/no sleep. Posted by u/Carl1961. People think I'm a serial killer. It's far worse than that. Part 1. I won't tell you my name. If you watch the news regularly, you probably already know it. I'm rather famous right now, or perhaps, more appropriately, infamous. The media has been covering my story for months, and I've been in all the major newspapers. My name is a source of heated debate. People discuss me in the office break room, and at bars and restaurants. Housewives scare each other with stories of me when they get together for lunch, embellishing my crimes, consulting their imaginations to conjure up the most lurid details they can come up with to get a rise out of their friends. I've been featured on all the big real-life crime shows, and various esteemed professionals in the psychiatric field and criminal profilers have sat down with talk show hosts and major network news pundits to offer their own insights and theories into what makes me tick, what caused me to become what I am. I won't keep you in suspense, I'll just come out and say it. I'm what most people would call a serial killer. I was apprehended 10 months ago after committing 40 murders in 10 states over an 8-year period, and am currently locked up in a federal prison. My murder trial is in progress, and the odds are not in my favor. There's a ton of evidence against me. Chances are good that I'll be convicted and probably sentenced to death. People are already comparing me to the likes of Bundy, Gacy, Gein, and Dahmer. I have to be escorted into the courthouse with armed guards and wearing a bulletproof vest because of death threats made against me by the grieving relatives of my victims. The outside of the courthouse is a circus whenever we arrive. Various journalists, spectators, curiosity seekers, freaks, you name it, are crowded around the front of the building in the hundreds. My trial is being televised, and my lawyer has told me it's the media event of the decade, like I'm supposed to be proud of that. I couldn't care less. Yes, I did commit those murders, all 40 of them. I won't deny it. No, I'm not a sociopath or a psychotic. I didn't hear voices telling me to do it. I didn't do it because God told me to do it in a dream to cleanse the world of sin. I didn't do it because I was trying to impress a celebrity or my dog told me to. I didn't do it for political reasons or to try to incite a race war like Manson did, either. I did it because I had to. Someone had to do it. I killed 40 people. But none of them were human. Maybe I should back up a bit and explain. I guess you can say I had a pretty rough beginning. I know that's the standard excuse most serial killers use to try and justify their behavior, but it's the truth. It all started when I was 8. That was when I lost my vision. My childhood was a living hell. I grew up dirt poor on the wrong side of the tracks, as they say. My old man was a no-good drunken redneck who had trouble holding down a steady job because of his alcoholism. He wasn't articulate enough to express his frustrations with his life situation in words, so instead he used his fists and hands on me and my mother to do it. For her part, my mother was a spineless asswipe who would rather stick with a man who routinely used her and her only child as a punching bag than leave him and try raising me on her own. I often showed up to school with bruises and an occasional black eye, but none of the teachers did shit about it because my family was poor white trash on welfare, so why should they give a fuck? To her credit, my school principal did try to get the police involved a time or two, but whenever they or social services showed up, my dad would always weasel his way out of it with some excuse or another, and my mom always backed him up. Then, after they left, he would beat the shit out of me for trying to start up trouble, as if I had any say in the principal calling them. It all came to a head one summer day when I was 8. I was out in the garage, playing with my old man's tools like most little kids will, pretending I was a plumber or a repairman or whatever. My dad stumbled in, drunk, saw his tools scattered around, and decided the most reasonable course of action was to pick up a pipe wrench and then proceed to bash my head in with it. I blacked out. When I woke up from my coma, 3 days later in the hospital, it was still black. At first I thought I was having trouble opening my eyes or I had a bandage over them. When I put up my hands to feel them and I realized there was no bandage covering my eyes and they were wide open, I began to freak out. The doctors explained to me that the vision center of my brain had been severely damaged in the beating and that I would never see again. My dad went to prison for that. He was sentenced to 25 years for attempted murder, but only served 2.5 before someone who took exception to child beaters stuck a shiv in his throat in the cafeteria. In my opinion, the bastard got off way too easy. He was dead, and I was sentenced to a lifetime of being blind. I guess having to take care of a blind kid was too much of a hassle for my mom, because she packed her bags and took off before I was even discharged from the hospital. I never, pardon the pun, saw her again. After that I went to live with my maternal grandparents. They were a decent enough couple, But they weren't much better off than my folks had been. My grandma wanted to send me to a special school for blind kids where they teach them how to adjust to life in the world after losing their sight, teach them Braille and that kind of thing, but those places cost money and that was something my grandparents didn't have much of to spare. Still, my childhood with them was a major improvement compared to the living hell I had endured before. They raised me as best as they could and tried to educate me on their own, but they were country people, and, well, not to sound ungrateful, not particularly bright. And it's not like I could attend a regular school in my condition. My grandpa died in a car accident caused by a drunk driver when I was 11, and then my grandma tried to raise me on her own until she died of a stroke when I was 15. After that, I was sent to live in a state-funded group home, which was just a fancy modern term for an orphanage. There my life returned to a living hell for the next 3 years as I endured abuse from the other kids, bullies taking advantage of my disability, while the overworked, underpaid staff, once again, pardon the pun, turned a blind eye. The administration tried to set me up with a foster family on several occasions, but I guess most people don't find the idea of taking in a blind teenager very appealing. When I was 18 and legally an adult, the group home kicked me out, leaving me to fend for myself. Isn't bureaucracy great? Which was no easy task for a blind guy with no real education or skills. I did the only thing I could think of. I turned to panhandling. I'd stand on the sidewalk with a cardboard sign a store owner had made for me out of pity, begging anyone who walked by, getting by on the charity of others. As I was to find out the hard way, in this day and age, a lot of people don't have much charity to spare, or compassion. I've been spit upon, insulted, called names, told to get a real job and accused of faking my blindness for sympathy. A couple times I even got beaten up, I guess just for kicks. It was pretty much just like it had been in the group home. For all I know, it even might have been the same kids. One hard lesson I've learned in my life is that some people never change. If you're born an asshole, you're going to die an asshole. There are some people who still have a spark of kindness in their hearts, though, and I usually made just enough during the day to buy a meal with. Mostly I slept outside using the narrow space behind a dumpster for shelter, bundling up in trash and old newspapers to stay warm. A few times someone was kind enough to guide me to a nearby homeless shelter so I wouldn't freeze to death in sub-zero weather. That was pretty much how my life went for the next 10 years. I got pretty bitter about it after a while, wondering if this was as good as it was going to get for me, if I would spend the rest of my life a blind beggar on a street corner, ignored by most of society, unable to even see the contemptuous expressions on the faces of those who walked by me, sleeping rough and having to forage through trash cans, eating the stuff others threw away on a particularly bad day when my earnings were pretty light. I started to wish I had never wakened from that coma, that my dad had just killed me. I started to contemplate suicide, thinking about just stepping into the road anytime I heard the sound of an approaching engine. I might have done it, too. Until I met him. The doctor. He came up to me one day, after I had just been pretty aggressively told off by a businessman. You learn to identify people based upon their smells and the way they talk. This guy's smell was a combination of expensive aftershave and briefcase leather, and he spoke to me in the arrogant, cultured, self-righteous tone of someone too important to waste their time or money on unwashed street trash like myself, who basically told me I was a leech upon society who didn't contribute anything and that I should drop dead. After the businessman walked away, I heard someone else approach and just stand there. I could sense them looking at me. You get that a lot? A new voice asked me. It sounded like an older man, probably in his 50s. I could detect a faint chemical smell to his clothes, almost medicinal in nature. Most days, yeah, I replied with a shrug. He began asking me questions. How old was I? How had I lost my sight? How long had I been on the streets? I answered his questions, which were pretty standard questions I got asked all the time, by those who bothered to speak to me at all. I might be able to help you, he told me. I figured he was just another do-gooder offering to buy me a hot meal and spare 20 minutes listening to me share my tale of woe, or some religious type wanting to give me an uplifting speech about how Jesus hadn't abandoned me, and the Lord tests us all and that when my trials were over I would see again in the kingdom of heaven. I had been fed that type of bullshit before, mostly by super pious middle-class churchgoers in their expensive Sunday clothes, on their way to breakfast after having fulfilled their weekly duty and given lip service to God, and most of them never spared me a dime, either. They probably didn't tip their server, either. That's something else I learned about people during my time as a panhandler. Most of the people who care, or claim to, only care as long as they don't have to pay for it. Hypocrisy at its finest. Sorry if I sound bitter, my experiences being homeless made me pretty cynical. Yeah, I told him dryly, How so? You gonna give me a new pair of eyes? It's not your eyes that are the problem. Based on what you've told me, it's your brain that's the source of the problem. He then got down to brass tacks and asked me a question that gave me pause. How would you like to regain your sight? People think I'm a serial killer. It's far worse than that. Part 2. I was taken aback a little by what he had said. What the fuck are you talking about? I'm talking about potentially restoring your sight. He said. Who are you anyway? Oh, forgive me. I haven't properly introduced myself. My name is Carl Steiner. Dr. Carl Steiner. That so? I replied, feeling a flash of intrigue when he mentioned the word doctor. Yes. MD, PhD. To be more specific, I'm a neurosurgeon. You mean a brain surgeon? Well, to put it in layman's terms, yes. He paused for a moment. You look hungry. Why don't we go get something to eat and then afterwards we can discuss this in depth? Are you picking up the tab? I asked. But of course. He had me hooked. I was in no position to turn down the offer of a free meal, having not eaten since the previous afternoon. Plus he had me genuinely interested when he mentioned possibly being able to restore my sight, although I didn't allow myself to get my hopes up too much. For all I knew he was some quack or con man. I decided to humor him and at the very least hear what he had to say. Sure, why not? I said with a shrug. Excellent. He took me to a local chain restaurant. We sat across from each other in a booth and he read the menu selections to me, giving my order to the server. He himself didn't order anything. The meal was easily the best I had had in weeks, which probably wasn't saying much since I had been sustained on a diet of fast food burgers and dumpster cast-offs for God only knew how long. I ate ravenously, gorging myself. He sat across from me, mostly in silence, and I could feel his eyes studying me. After I had finished eating, he got down to business and laid it all out for me. He was a rather well-regarded neurosurgeon, now semi-retired, who had been an expert in the field of brain surgery for over 30 years. He had once worked for a major city hospital before stepping down and now worked teaching as a professor at a nearby medical school. He had recently made a major breakthrough in neurosurgery and devised a radical new procedure to repair damage to the occipital lobe in the brain, the part of the brain that controlled vision. The part of my brain that had been turned into paste thanks to dear old dad back when I was 8. He and his colleagues were looking for volunteer test subjects to try this new procedure out on, and I fit the bill. In addition to possibly being able to see again, I would be compensated for my contribution to medical science to the tune of $20,000. He warned me that the surgery was still highly experimental and not without risk. I could die or be rendered paralyzed or brain dead. When he was finished talking, he fell silent, awaiting my response. Frankly, I didn't feel like I had much to lose. My life was already shit. If it worked like he said it should, I would have my sight back, and be 20 grand richer to boot. I would have a shot of finally being able to live a normal life. And if something went wrong and I wound up dead or a vegetable, well, then I wouldn't have to worry anymore about going hungry on a street corner without a roof over my head, at constant risk of starvation or dying from exposure, or even being murdered for thrills by some psycho who knew the cops wouldn't give fuck one about some blind homeless guy getting offed. This had actually happened to a couple guys I was casually acquainted with through my infrequent visits to the homeless shelter. I felt it was a win-win situation either way, so I didn't give it much thought before giving him my answer. Let's go for it. He seemed pleased with my response. We shook on it and he told me he would be in touch, and he knew where to find me when the time came. 3 weeks later, a taxi cab pulled up to me while I was on the sidewalk on another unsuccessful venture to generate some income through the mostly non-existent sympathy of any pedestrians who passed by. The driver told me he had been sent by Dr. Steiner to take me to the medical campus to prep me for surgery. He guided me into the back of the taxi and off we went. 18 hours later, I was on an operating table surrounded by a team of physicians and technicians led by Dr. Steiner himself. He stood by my side and asked me if I was ready. I told him I was. He gave my shoulder a reassuring squeeze and told me I would be fine, although I thought I detected a faint note of uncertainty in his voice. I was hugely excited, knowing that when I woke up I might be able to finally see the face of the man who was giving me this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and also terrified that I might not wake up at all. But there was no backing out now. The anesthesiologist placed the mask over my face and I breathed deeply, fading into the blackness without even knowing it, because the blackness had already been there all along. When I regained consciousness, my head, which was heavily bandaged, hurt like hell. My eyes were covered, but even through the layers of gauze, I could tell the surgery had been a success. I could detect light with my eyes, a barely perceptible sense of brightness. I sat up excitedly, and immediately, strong arms restrained me and forced me back down to the bed. I struggled. "Hey, let me go." Dr. Steiner spoke my name from in front of me and told me, "You must remain calm and relax. You need time to recover from the surgery." "No. Take the bandages off. I want to see." "You'll have to wait at least another 3 days before the bandages can be removed, I'm afraid. To do so before could be detrimental too." "But you don't understand." I shouted. "It worked. I can see the light through the bandages." "I do understand, and I'm glad to hear that, but you must remember you've been blind for the past 20 years. Your eyes will be extremely sensitive to light and it could be very painful. You'll need to keep them covered until they've had time to adjust to what light they can already perceive." "Fuck you, man." I screamed. "If you don't calm down, I'm afraid I'll have to have your arms put in restraints and administer a sedative," he told me in a stern, authoritative voice. I sighed and finally relented. The arms holding me down, which I assumed belonged to a pair of orderlies, released me. Dr. Steiner spoke to me in a gentler tone. "I can understand your excitement, and I know you're eager to see again, but this is necessary. All good things take time." "If you say so," I muttered. I heard Dr. Steiner leave, but the two orderlies stayed with me in what I presumed was some kind of post-op recovery room to make sure I didn't try unwrapping my eyes myself. I lay there feeling miserable. I could finally see again after all these years, but I was still blind beneath the bandages wrapped around my head. I felt bitter at the irony of it. The next 3 days were going to be an eternity. If I had known what was to come, I would have kept my eyes bandaged. I would have preferred being blind.
Thanks for watching. Please do like, share, comment and subscribe for more videos.